So my question is, why Japan?
Oh, okay. So when I was about 19, I was driving in a car and my sister had bought me a necklace that looks a little like this. It has the same gargoyle. I managed to find the gargoyle. It's hard to get it in the camera, but there's a gargoyle with a tongue, and it had a sword too. And it was I was such a genius because I put this knife on my visor while driving, and a TV hit the car. It was in the back of a truck and it fell out and this big TV fell into the car and my car spun and hit a bunch of walls. And I actually wasn't injured, but what did happen is I was cut by the knife because, like I said, I was a genius and I put this knife on my visor and it cut my head and I was knocked out by airbags. And then I had a dream of that necklace and I ended up writing and writing. And I wrote 10 novels. And the novels ended up being,
Interrelated?
yeah, all related. It was about soulmates fighting demons who steal souls. And I moved to Japan to make these novels into manga and find an artist who would do it. And I've been working on that for quite a while since I was 19. So for people who think the anthology took a while, that I've been waiting much longer for these mangas to come out. And next year I'm gonna have the first one. Yeah. So
So having done several magazines, including recently here at the public library, a poetry magazine
yeah.
involving, 40 or 50 writers and production value in limited dollars. I'm very well aware of how much personal time it can occupy just to get the layout and the font and the proper credits and the proper biographical notes for the people that are in it and not have any errors. And I did have an associate editor who caught a few things that otherwise would have gone to print. So that was nice.
Yeah.
Um, but I can appreciate it. It's hundreds and hundreds of hours.
Hmm. Yeah, it's always good to have an extra pair of eyes. And you do a lot of editing and then you have someone else edit. So when I hear a writer tell me something like they edit alone, I'm always surprised. What do you feel about I mean, how do you feel about that? Writers who edit alone?
That's like an engineer writing software and testing his own software on his own machine.
Yeah.
It's functional. It certainly serves a purpose in terms of does it meet the basic standard requirements,
Mm.
but you can't test how someone else on another machine, maybe another operating system, uh, would see it or even be able to execute the application. And very much the same way with editing. And I love editing other people's work. I've been known to write 4 or 5 pages of critique for a one-page story
Oh,
for certain students. And the first time I do that and show that to them, they back away like, whoa, I really wasn't expecting this. Uh, uh, but I know from that experience that it changes the story for the better if one wants more than one reader. If
yeah.
you're only writing for yourself, then editing yourself is not a problem. But if you're hoping to have at some future point other readers, it makes sense, good sense. Now I can say that, but when I did my master's program in writing, I was notorious for never revising my stories.
Oh,
And they got a little annoyed with me at a certain point, and so I worked for a semester with a novelist who I tremendously respect. Her name is Jane Smiley. She's, uh, 6 feet tall and very, very giving to her students, very generous with her time. And she decided to pick one of my stories.
yeah.
Um, and we worked on that one story for an entire semester. I revised it 27 times. I've never done that with any of my stories.
Mhm.
And she very much adopted the Raymond Carver approach to revision, or the John Gardner approach to revision, which is re-vision, not just editing. We're not
Yeah.
just making it trimmer or thinner or better word usage or drop what's not necessary.
Yeah.
We're entirely revisualizing the piece every time we do it, to a point where the story took me to places I had not imagined it going. And since then, I very much like that, the notion that the story has its own ambitions and goals and endpoint.
Mm.
And you may or may not see it as the writer. You're
Yeah.
just a vehicle. And you're not serving it very well if all you're doing is writing the mountain that you're climbing. That's fine. There's no judgment here.
Yeah.
But if you're really expecting other mountain climbers to read it with interest, um, a review cycle of people whose opinions you respect, um, is eye-opening. It's always eye-opening.
Absolutely.
Even if it just catches something that you didn't intend, that doesn't mean that it doesn't stay in the story, but it makes it conscious. So, for those that will hear it, self-editing isn't really editing. It's
Yeah.
just polishing the stones you've collected on the beach.
Mm.
But if you want to make it jewelry, you've got to engage other people in the process of manufacturing that, because you're probably not as good at editing as you are at writing.
Mm.
In my case, I think I'm probably a better editor of other people's work than I am my own. And
Yeah.
and if I had to pick the two, I would say I'm a better editor. Um,
Mm.
More disciplined as an editor than I am disciplined as a writer.
Yeah. Through the process of this anthology, I become an editor too, and
You
never
have
thought
to.
I'd be one. But it's made me realize how important it is. I mean, before that, I hired a lot of freelance editors because I would never put something out until an editor read it first. It was a rule of mine. So I'd always pay an editor to edit. And it just seemed natural to me, like the process of doing things. And my work was always accepted. And I went, well, maybe that's the reason, because I have someone polish it up and I take their advice. And it really does matter to have an editor, and it helps a lot. So I totally agree with you. You put it really well, the way you put
It
it.
comes with experience, though, I think. Adolescent writers, and even, my second story, and we're going back some 50 years, was in an anthology for Scribners, and they actually paid me $100 for it, which meant they owned the first rights.
Yeah.
And what I learned was that gave them permission to edit my work and publish it the way they wanted it to look. And the nice thing about it was that they left 99% of it intact. They loved the story. But the last line was removed when it was published. And so I called them and I asked the editor, you know, they didn't think that it served the story well to end it with that last line, because it made it about me rather than the characters in the story. And 20 years later, I agreed with them, but at the time I was just self-righteous and indignant. And when the book came out, it was reviewed in the New York Times. And when the anthology came out in the libraries, I lived in California then. I went to 5 of the biggest public libraries, checked out the book, and hand wrote the line back in. Shame on me.
That's great. Did you sign it too, so that people knew why?
Initialed it. I
Yeah.
initialed it. But in retrospect, as I've said, they were right. From an editorial perspective, the whole thing was about 2 characters talking at the bar, and then suddenly there's this last line from a different point of view.
Mm.
And I didn't see that for years after I had written the story. So different eyes, different things, and it depends on what you want from your writing. You know, if you really are writing for yourself, then editorial concerns are less important, I think, than the self recognition that you might be undergoing in your journal or memoir or whatever. But if you're really sending it out to magazines, you're doing a readers, the potential readers, a disservice, and possibly yourself, because you won't, there may be something stuck in the middle there that makes sense to you. In fact, in the latest volume of the literary magazine, we found it at the library here. My editor called and said, "In your poem, Lift Me Up, did you mean dark back earth or dark black earth?" And I said, "Black, of course." And she said, "Well, that's not how it is on the page." Um, and I had been sending that poem out in revised form to multiple magazines for multiple years. I saw it differently than she was able to see it, and so I was finally able to produce a corrected version. Um, but we don't see it. We are not our best reader, or even close to our best reader. Um, and I don't know that we should be. I mean, if you're really looking for work that means something to other people, uh, engaging them at the very end of the process, it's sort of, again, like a software analogy. Let's find out, let's build a piece of software for 2 years and then find out if anybody is interested in using it. Well,
Yeah.
that's kind of a waste of time.
Yeah.
It might, you might learn a lot during the process, but if you want it to be functional, you might want to engage the customer early on, and then absorb some of their feedback. So, but as I said, I've changed my approach, my interest in that sort of thing over time. Um, Particularly when I was publishing a couple of authors in the last volume of the magazine. We had several people who wrote in their own language and translated it to English to be published.
Oh,
And one was, she wrote in Hindu and then translated it to English. Another person was a Ukrainian poet. She's very well known on the East Coast. Um, and so I would go through the poem with the Hindu poet and say, are you aware that when you say Mayflower, one word, to an American audience, they're going to think pilgrims in the 1600s. They're not going to think spring bloom.
very often, yeah.
And she said, "Oh, I didn't know," because culturally she didn't know that. And another one of the poets wrote about, it was a phoenix theme. And the phoenix, as it's lifting from the ashes, the wing tips are aflame.
Mm.
And she did it in one word, wingtips. And I said, "Are you aware that anybody 50 years and older probably thinks you're talking about a shoe?"
Yeah.
And just to be aware of it, and when we write, we only see it the way we want. We only see it and hear the words, the music of it, the way we want to hear it. And sometimes that's enough, and that's okay. Uh, Very often it's eye-opening.
Yeah, absolutely.
So tell me, when you got the idea for the anthology, because that's sort of what we're supposed to talk about,
Okay.
where did the idea come from? Why 42? Why 1,700 plus contributors? What led to those decisions?
Well, I think it's better to answer the last question first because 42 squared is 1,764. So that's the number. Why that many?
I
And that's
figured there
why the
was a
book title is
correlation.
as 42 Stories Anthology Presents, Book of 42 Squared, because it's 42 squared. So that's that answer. The other one's a little longer, but this is also your interview too, so I want to give you time. But basically, I had what is it? I had 8 back surgeries total. Um,
Wow.
and the first 4 was when I was in high school. And well, there was 3 when I was in high school, and then 1 more when I turned 20. And but all of those were made my back worse. The first ones. And my back was basically being crushed by the inside, and I was like, I was either going to be paralyzed or die if I didn't get it fixed, because my back was like a slinky, and it was hard to walk, hard to do anything. And but I was still doing it, just doing my best. And I found the best doctor in the world to fix backs in Dallas. This guy wrote books about it. He was like an architect, and actually he was an architect before he became a doctor. And he wrote the book on the spine, and he fixed my back after 4 more surgeries. And but during the surgeries, I was reflecting on my life while I was really bad off, which is I was focused on
Mhm.
writing, and there were a lot of people in my life who were helping me write, like editors I mentioned, and writers groups, writers circles, friends who would read my work. Just people were always so helpful to me. And an author I'd reflect on to like laugh at, and read their work was Douglas Adams. Uh,
Mhm.
and I was reading through these books while going through all this pain, and they'd always cheer me up. And then
Mhm.
and I thought I want to give back to writers. And then and I said if I live through these last surgeries, I'm gonna come up with an idea to do it. And I took the idea from 42, and I thought that I would have 42 word stories, and that built into 42 chapters, 42 words, 42 word bios, 42 character titles, all that stuff. But I
And
wanted to help
when
write.
and the reason I submitted my poem to it, separate from the editorial role, because I think I
Yeah.
did a chapter,
Okay.
um, is it was a puzzle.
Yeah.
And it wasn't a puzzle that at face value was going to take 6 years of my life. You know, it was more like, "I could do that this weekend. Let's give it a shot," you
Hmm.
know, and then see what comes out, and then it was like, "Really? 42 letters in the title? Okay, I'll play around with that for a little while," and then it's like, "Oh my god, shrink my bio to 42." The layers of it, um, insisted that I take it more seriously than I had originally intended, and that's good. It was a very inviting opening to a very fully engaged role, and I feel lucky to have been involved in it. It'll be interesting to see how other writers respond. Um, but I started out with, well, let's just give this a shot, like a writer's prompt. I don't have to send it to them if it doesn't turn out well, you know.
Hmm.
um,
So that was the you called it hidden in my book of long forgotten things.
mm,
And I remember liking it. And the thing is I wasn't picking the stories totally. I was helping, but I had a team, and it had to be 2 votes. And that's what it came down to. But I remember liking your story. If you want, why don't you give it a read? I have it in the chat for you if you want.
I don't even remember.
It's in the chat now.
There
So
we go.
why don't you give it a read so that our readers can get it? It's not in the book, but instead you ended up being one of the guest judges for the fight chapter, which
Yes.
I think was better because being a guest judge.
So I'll just read it. Yes.
Thanks.
Hidden in my book of long forgotten things. It was not, as he first thought, the memory of his grandmother's soap or its aroma. It was the moment when, still a boy, he saw white tiles beneath her amazing claw footed tub. saw six-sided tiles for the very first time. Now, this was a poem I wrote a very long time ago. So the poem is actually long forgotten as well as the memory. But to get it to the 42 limitation, I had to edit out my own experience of it, some sections, and it felt very much like meeting someone for the first time and they say, well, I'd be glad to meet with you again, but I'd like you to be shorter.
Mm.
And it's like, well, how do I do that? That
Yeah.
wasn't what I expected here. But very often I find that whether it's that bathtub or the boy's first memory or um, the six-sided tiles, which I have some over here because the building was torn down. It becomes less about me on the printed page and more about us as writer-reader.
Yeah.
And that changes the dynamic. Jacques Lacan had this great essay during the period of time when apparently he was thrown out of the psychoanalytic conference in Europe by the very people that invited him to join. He wrote an essay. It's a minor little essay, but it has to do with how when you are in individual therapy with a therapist, the psychologist and the client join and become a third entity. There's a third circle in that dynamic, and that's the circle he recommended that the analyst be aware of in order that you can guide toward a healthy conclusion. But this notion, apparently in Europe in the 1900s, this was, unacceptable that there would be another person in the room. um, and very often, when the reader reads something, they'll see something in it that you did not intend.
Yeah.
And that's not a bad thing. That's actually the magic of literature, where I can write something that means something to me, and you, with your experience. So I talk about a tree outside of a window, and to me, it's Garden of Eden and picking apples and climbing when I was a kid. To you, because you once fell out of a tree onto a picket fence,
Mm.
trees mean something entirely different to you than to me.
Oh, yeah.
And you bring that wealth of life experience to your reading of the work in a way that I could not possibly intend or include. And that's not bad. That's good. Rich work invites a broader interpretation than the limited interpretation that the writer has of their own work, I think.
Yeah. So I want to reflect back to the anthology on that. You were the guest judge for the fight chapter. And while you're talking about writers, why did you pick the fight chapter?
Well, I think you asked me because we discussed our interest in Japanese culture from two different approaches. I had studied a Japanese martial art
Aikido.
for many, many years
Yeah.
and taught it to children, which was a complete joy, mostly in California. When I was young enough to be able to throw and be thrown and still stand up, at the end of the throw. I never saw my martial arts training or as a teacher what I was conveying to my students as a fighting art. This wasn't, mixed martial arts. This wasn't even competitive karate. This was Aikido, which is much more harmonious, and if you don't attack me, there's nothing I need to do, and I'm trying to absorb all of your energy and turn it back on you in an imbalancing sort of way. Psychologically, that's not a fight,
No.
to my mind, anyway. Um, but I said, why not? I mean, that's sort of, if I can help, I'll do it that one, sure. Um, and I remember there was a wide variety of writing styles, and uh, I'll say quality, but I don't mean it in a valuational way.
Yeah, I agree.
Um, Sophistication of sentences, conveyance on a page, all of these things which one comes to eventually in one's writing life. But when none of us, when we start out thinking, I want to be a writer, or I want to write 10 novels about this, or this necklace, or whatever it turns out to be,
Mm,
craft is rarely the first thing that engages you.
yeah.
It's the passion of the work, it's the idea, it's the conveyance. And then you want a meaningful person, maybe someone you love, or maybe someone whose opinion you respect, be able to watch them read it as they're reading it
Oh, yeah.
and watch their facial expressions. And that's a terrific joy that I've only had once or twice. But that's
Mm,
very different than publishing a book and getting responses from people who do not know me,
mhm.
because they're not thinking of Stuart Robbins, they're thinking of the work. And the work itself led them to a certain place that I couldn't have possibly predicted. I have one chapter in that book on, and it's interesting. It's my favorite chapter. It's on baseball technology
Mm,
and the changes that have occurred in the sport over the years as technology has either allowed them to travel the country, or get more money because it went from radio to TV, whatever the technology was at the time.
yeah.
Um, and as I was approaching that, I was thinking, that's not why I loved baseball as a kid. I wasn't thinking strike zone and robots and foul balls and replay on TV. None of that occurred to me as a kid. It was the sound of the ball, the bat against the ball,
Mm,
and how much that sound was like home for
yeah.
me. And much later, the reason I came out back to Illinois, actually, one of the reasons was to interview a Carl Erskine who pitched for the Brooklyn Dodgers in 1942 to 53, I think, something, um, in the World Series, and held a strikeout record until Koufax beat it. And I got to interview him. And my first face to face interview with him, I was explaining my love of the sport. And I
Mm,
went to that place where it was the sound of a wooden bat squarely against that round ball, and how the magic of that sound was so beautiful to me. And he just looked at me. He just passed away. So he was 94 at the time, and said, that sound gave me nightmares. And
oh,
I went, oh, you're a pitcher. I hadn't even, of course, that
yeah.
sound has a completely different impact on you than it did on me. But until that moment, it's a perfect example of perspective.
Mm,
We can have a very pure and even well written and well presented work,
yeah.
and someone else brings an entirely different perspective to the core metaphor.
Mm.
Um,
Well, before I totally forget to mention it, since you mentioned liking baseball, I'm reading a book right now about, well, listening to. Lately, I don't have a lot of time to read because I'm writing a dissertation and working on a lot of things.
Understood.
The book is called The Housekeeper and the Professor by Yoko Ogawa.
Hmm.
And this guy loses his memory every 80 minutes. but he's like this amazing mathematician. He is an amazing mathematician, not he's like one. But his biggest thing is baseball. He says that it's the best sport for math. And I think you'd really appreciate the book.
I think, I just recently finished Doris Kearns Goodwin's memoir of her childhood growing up and having the experience of going over box scores with her father at the end of every day. And he would ask her questions and he would say, well, if he went 3 for 4, what would that have been? And so there was a whole generation of us that came upon math because of baseball.
Oh, yeah.
It may not have been, you know, the central thesis for us. It was sort of sneaky to those kids. I
Mhm.
understood batting averages long before I could calculate anything else other than batting averages.
Yeah.
Um, and earned run average was different than batting average. And I understood the very clear distinction between the two. But if you put a math problem in front of me and said, is this or that, I wouldn't have a clue. I was what? Fifth grade, sixth grade, seventh grade.
Yeah.
Um, there's also something about the diamond and the perfectly, I mean, I love baseball fields, particularly the ones that are well manicured,
Right.
um, because they themselves are an image that conveys a mathematical standard. Whether it's 60 feet, 6 inches, or whatever it is that, if you're in Cincinnati, old Crosley Field had a hill up in center field that the runners had to run up to in order to catch a ball at the fence. No other place had one.
Okay.
But if you were bunting toward third base and running to first, the math was exactly the same no matter what team you were playing, no matter what field you were playing in. And so there's a root standard that was reliable. And for the book that I didn't end up writing, there's a Masonic aspect to the diagram of the field.
Mm.
If you think about the Mason's basic compass and square
Yeah.
image, it is a baseball diamond. And in doing further research, there were Native American tribes long before they met the Masons, uh, long before Abner Doubleday or whomever it was uh, popularized the sport. Same shape. So there's a conveyance, there's a visual metaphor that is mathematically pure,
Mhm.
that has meaning to it. Um, and it almost is independent of the guys that are and women and men that are running around the field hitting and throwing and catching. Um, because when they're done, the field is still the same.
Yeah.
I also liked it because I'm now in Danville, Illinois, where I grew up as a young man and left in
Okay.
college and didn't come back for 45 years. Um, and there is something about the nature of coming home, which baseball's the only sport that has that as its optimal goal.
Hmm.
Everybody tries
Come
to
home.
run the bases and come home. And so
Hmm.
to write a book about baseball when I came home um, just seemed impossible. It was like the universe was pulling it out of me. But then COVID hit and we missed a marketing opportunity. So that was too bad. The stories have been published, but I did
Yeah.
have a good opportunity to meet some fascinating. I would interview people. We had a minor league team in town, never a
Oh.
major league team for many years.
Hmm.
And so there are 35 or 40 accomplished major league players, including 6 or 8, Hall of Famers who had come through town for a summer or two playing in this town, this tiny little Midwestern forgettable town. And so I wanted to write a story about that field and the people that visited it as players and coaches and owners. And um, Jackie Robinson even visited it here his rookie or second year, and that's what I thought 42 was. That's
Yeah.
what I think it was in a Poets and Writers magazine had an ad for 42.
Oh,
Maybe
that's
not.
great.
But I saw 42 and went, Jackie Robinson, I'm writing baseball stories. I want to know more about this. And it turns out that it had nothing to do with Jackie Robinson. But
Yeah, it wasn't until some of the writers asked me if it did that I
of
thought about
course.
it at all. And I wanted to get an illustrator to do a picture of Jackie Robinson holding, well, at least wearing a shirt 42. Where there's 42 covers also in every chapter, illustrated by different illustrators. But I couldn't get that image. But it would have been really nice. It's just what we have is pretty cool though. It's still a baseball player. But yeah, Jackie
So I
Robinson.
do have a couple of, so when I interviewed Carl wrote several books about the Brooklyn Dodgers in,
Oh,
in his early years. Things lessons I've learned from Jackie is one of them. And they do have pictures of Jackie Robinson. I could probably find you the originals if you're still interested. Though at this point, you're probably in a production cycle saying, no, Stuart, even though that's what I'm looking for, that's not what I can do now. I've got other
as long
things.
as it's not copywritten, I'd be willing to look. I'd be willing to see if it could fit. Yeah, sure. I can just I can't promise anything, but yeah, if you
No, of
email
course, it's
something,
not,
I can.
I'm a photographer is not one of my goals. Whenever I do covers for my own work, it's like, should I ask someone else to do this? Because I certainly am not really
Go ahead
good
and
at it.
email it to me, and I'll see what I could do. I'm actually working on working on not fixing, on finalizing everything so that it could come out by November.
Fixing it's an interesting slip of the tongue because I've often felt like that's what I was doing, either to get, because of bleed and margins,
Yeah,
one line goes over to the next page, and you
yeah,
really don't want to do that. So you have to change the spacing and the margins to get that one piece on one page, and that
mm,
might take you longer than it took the author to write
yeah.
the work.
Well, as odd as it might sound, the whole 42 character title thing has a purpose. If it's longer, you could tell on the contents page that it's too long
Mm,
because they fit a certain way,
yes.
the way that the margins are. And so as I'm looking through it, I said fixing, thinking about that because I'm actually going through and fixing a lot of them. A lot of them aren't 42 characters. So I have to use the whole first rights thing you mentioned earlier and fix up these titles a little bit. There's not too many though, but
I've I've I have a real
hmm,
love for titles, and I
yeah,
find that some people don't think about titles to their work. An
hmm,
awful lot of the people in the writers group that I supervised for a while, um,
oh,
well, it was called Sam or it was called Dorothy, and because that was the name of the character that the chapter was about. And there was a line on the second to last page that was just remarkable, and it almost begged to become the title of the story. And
oh,
whenever I would point that out to people, they would think, yeah, that's better. That's not bad actually, because I see titles often in poems. It's less of an issue than with longer prose, but it is the first line. It is the
yeah,
first engagement with the reader, and
the
you're
first hook.
missing and if you're not using everything you could possibly use to make that first line inviting, it's a missed opportunity.
Hmm,
It's like when I used to tell them that the reader sees the poem on the page before they read the poem on the page.
hmm,
So the shape of the poem, uh, with all of the white space or none, is a way of also inviting the reader in. And if you aren't aware of it, I mean, you're aware of it on a subliminal level because whenever you go to a bookstore and you thumb through a book, you go, "Oh, that looks interesting." But it looks interesting because of these things, not because of the content of the stories that you haven't read yet that motivated those writers to write them. Um, I had one story that the title was longer than the story itself. Um, that fascinates me. People think it's a little odd to be fascinated by such things, but
Hmm.
um,
Yeah. Is this your writing space, by the way?
this is my writing space. It is. I tend to wherever I move. It's funny because when I moved back to Danville here, I had no books, no artwork. It was all in storage in Oakland, California, and then slowly, as I took trips there and drove back, I would bring things out.
Hmm.
But the books I bought at used bookstores for a buck a piece or the library on the book sale. So I now have, for the most important works that are meaningful to me, I have two copies, one here and one in Oakland, because they're still sitting in boxes out there. But yes, it is the writing space I have.
Okay. Um, are there any authors that that kind of stick out to you among those books you mentioned?
Well, I always have right behind me under the ampersand.
Hmm.
um, Scott Russell Sanders
Oh,
is a
Sanders.
is a actually an Indiana writer. He's written many books, but the first one that captivated my attention entirely was more of a memoir of why he loved living in the Midwest. Um, and there are just whole sections in that book that sing to me. I hear them. Um, I've had a chance to meet with him too. He even judged the prose competition for the second magazine that we did. Um, and his latest book, which is, I think, Small Marvels, is really a small marvel itself.
Okay.
It's an easy read. It's about, you know, just beneath the surface of these plain Midwestern folk is an awful lot going on.
Yeah.
Um, he taught at Indiana University for, I think, 30 or 40 years and
Oh.
has since retired. Um, but his books are there. There's a poet who published my first poem in 1972, sat at a kitchen table with me in his home in northern Ohio and worked on the poem with me for hours, until it was its hardened, bristled self. And I walked out almost exhausted from that session. And then he printed that poem, and it was such a gift for him to me that I wanted to return that at various points in my life. I've tried. And so to be able to publish his poems 40 years later in the magazine I was editing uh, just felt like a lovely circle complete. His name is Bruce Weigl. Um,
Okay.
he was at Oberlin the same time I was at Oberlin. And we had a lot of friends in common, most of whom, Tom Lux and Franz Wright, and have since passed away.
Hmm.
Um,
Yeah.
I've found that, at least in my life, over the course of years, I've become much more sympathetic with the unknowable plight of others.
Yeah.
Um, there is a reason why they are behaving this way.
Hmm.
They may not know it, nor would they care to have you point it out to them. Um, but almost everything we do is developmental in one form or another. And that empathy is very much what I think we ask of readers,
Yeah.
to bring your good self, your best self to the page, so that when I offer something to you, you absorb it as best you can. And I'm not asking for anything in return. Just that shared experience of the moment of your reading. And when I did get one message from somebody, because my book in 2007 was actually formally published and had therefore marketed to other people, um, people I didn't know. And so I got a long fan letter back from somebody who could not have possibly understood me. They were purely responding to the story and how it impacted them. And that, that stranger feedback was magnificent. It was unpredictable. And until you get that, I mean, I've had editors send back rather rude things and then meet them
Yeah.
and think, do you have any idea, what that cursory remark had an impact on me? Oh my God, I was such a jerk during those years, whatever it turned out to be. So I try to, as an editor, I try to be as kind as possible,
Mm. Yeah.
because we're, both writer and reader are engaged in something.
Well, one thing that computers have done, along with giving us a lot of technology, is they've created keyboard warriors, where
Yes.
people get these things and then they forget the people on the other side were being warriors against our humans, and that's a lot of what's happening. But I try to be understanding and know that sometimes they don't realize they're writing to a person. It doesn't always happen.
Well,
What's
and in their head, they aren't. I mean, it may be
yeah.
for like I said, for an entirely different reason that they're responding. My dad
Mm.
used to remind me that, sometimes, I think we were talking about a certain teacher in high school, and he goes, sometimes the general yells at the lieutenant, who
Mm.
yells at the private, who comes home and kicks his dog.
Yeah.
And is the general responsible for the pain that dog is feeling? No.
Yeah.
Completely disconnected, except by sequence, of course.
Mm.
Um, and yet we should appreciate that there is a consequence to what we do, and bring our best selves to it whenever we can.
Yeah. There's a Latin phrase that goes with, which people say is a phallus, but I don't think it is. It's a post hoc ergo propter hoc, which is one thing happens after another because of it. But as you said, it's not the lieutenant's fault that the dog got kicked, which is saying it's not actually the
Correct.
fault. It's but things can relate and become a sequence, which is what
Now,
that is all.
people would love to take credit for good things, like if I say something to you and you go do a painting as a result that wins a bunch of awards, I'm going to take all the credit you're willing to give me for that. But no pain, no disagreeableness, no, unintentional disregard. And that's just humans being humans. I think that we have forgotten sometimes that there is a generosity of spirit in print that affords us a vehicle for something else,
Yeah.
something different. And do we misuse it? Yes. Do we serve it well? No. If I imagine the muses are looking down and going, I'm not going to get involved with them anymore. They just take what I give them and hurt each other. Uh,
Mm.
but every
Um,
once in a while, you come across a kind soul who does something unexpected.
yeah.
And it's almost as if they offered you a poem, a gift,
Yeah.
and to be able to continue to want to do that in the current environment, maybe naive, and if a 71-year-old man can be called naive, I'll take that at this point. It would have been upsetting at a certain point in my life, but now it's like, I'll take naive. So thank you for asking me to read it because I had forgotten
Oh,
which of my pieces was in there.
yeah.
Um,
Well, I remembered when I saw your name when you emailed about the judges. I actually remembered your story because I liked it. And
oh, that's nice.
some of them stick out, some of them don't, but yours stuck out. And I was happy that you asked about
I think I'll find, because I really did. It's still a prose poem.
Hmm.
I, called Soap Memory. And it's the little bubbles between his toes as he steps out of the claw-footed tub
Oop memory.
that it was the triggering point for the memory. But it's probably twice as long.
Happy to read it.
So I'll show it to you purely for the interest of what got left out in order to meet the standard.
Hmm.
Which was as much a mathematical exercise,
Hmm.
number of letters, length of line.
Hmm.
If it was too complicated, I'll pull it out. I have a horrible habit of editing things that have already been published. So, they have a life of their own. The kids are off, with their own families, and I'm still meddling.
It's funny that earlier you mentioned the Raymond Carver method because he did that too. I've heard stories of people finding him editing his books.
Yes, yes. And as an intellectual exercise, I get that. Where I'm a better writer now than I was in my 40s or 50s. I read some things I wrote then and am embarrassed by them.
Hmm.
And if I were to write them now with the additional 30 years of writing behind me, they would be a much better story.
Hmm.
Um, but if I spend all of my time thinking that way, I will never write anything new. I will just spend the rest of my life rewriting what I've already written. And I've still got a few things on the list that need to get onto the page. So I try to avoid it unless absolutely necessary. But sometimes it's like, someone wrote and asked me it's like changing your bio notes. So an editor asked me for I submitted bio notes when I submitted my work to them. They accepted it. That's very nice. It'll be out in a couple of years. Then they wrote back and said, "Can you resend your bio notes?"
Hmm.
Well, that was a year ago. I've got 3 other things I want to mention.
Mm-hmm.
It's a similar sort of thing. It's sort of like with the graphical tools that we have at our disposal now, editing a photograph, which
Yeah.
is really a recalling of a memory to the point where it's less history and more fiction,
Mm-hmm.
which is not wrong. Um, I don't think I've always had the perspective. In fact, my college essay, so I'm really dating myself here, um, was about memory is the same process as imagination, just in a different direction.
Hmm.
Same rules apply, same risks, less truth than one would imagine. Um, because I was always surprised when I would show a family story, a family recognition, a fishing trip story, or whatever, to my father, and he goes, "That's not the way it happened." And to me, I couldn't separate my memory of that moment, whether he had he had this grand idea because he was fishing for much bigger fish than I was, to attach 3 barbed hooks to the legs of a live frog,
Oh.
and then put a little harness on it so that when he threw the frog out there, it could easily swim around and attract much bigger fish. This was his idea. I was
Hmm.
about 12 when this happened. And so he spent the night. I mean, he rubbed the frog's belly until he was just like, oh, fine, do what you want. And attached, with very lovely knots, the 3 barbed hooks. And as we rode out the following morning, he wound up and threw, and one of the hooks embedded in his thumb, and he couldn't get it
Okay.
out. And the frog is wriggling around. We're talking about this was not an intended consequence. After such a big plan, we went to the hospital because the doctor had to snip the hook and then push it through the other side.
Yeah.
Um, and he just asked, "Well, what were you thinking?" And my father explained what he was thinking. He goes, "Well, I wouldn't have done that." Well, yeah, there are sometimes unintended so that story, obviously, from my point of view as a child going to the hospital with my father because there's a frog hanging from his hand, is a different story than the man who wanted to impress his son and didn't want to admit to any pain and felt bad about the frog but felt worse about the son as he's driving to the hospital. Those are two different stories. And so
Yeah.
when he says that's not how this happened, he's not incorrect.
Hmm.
Our two memories of the very same moment can be two very different memories.
Hmm.
Um, Small t truth goes right out the window as soon as we put a pen to paper.
Yeah.
Um, and yet, I can see the difference between things that really happened in a story and things that the story has drawn itself toward because you know, I think it was Robert Frost had this great line, no surprise for the writer, no surprise for the reader.
Yeah.
Um, and I love that surprise when the story takes off and goes in a different direction than you expected. Um, but I know the difference between a one-story house and a two-story house. I know the difference. The story needed a second floor
Hmm.
for that particular event to happen because someone had to fall down the stairs, and I didn't it wasn't the place I grew up in, but I said it was so that we could have this story located there. But in my mind, I see a very clear distinction between stagecraft and memory, and the difference between memory and truth. But for the reader, none of that matters
Yeah.
if it's well written. If it's
Hmm.
well written, the seamlessness between those invented things um, is the goal. So I see Ray Carver writing about his time at Iowa and drinking, and he had a very different perspective on that much later in his life than he did when he was drinking. And I could see wanting to, if we have the slice of hubris to think that this thing that we're writing might live beyond us, some read by someone long after we're gone. Um, they deserve an attentiveness, as I said, to shape and function and grammar. And I loved Virginia. Virginia Woolf has this great moment where she says, one of the things I've learned is that it's important in a long story to alternate long and short sentences to
Yeah.
keep the reader engaged. And until I had read that of hers, I wasn't aware but I went back and looked at her stories, and sure enough, there's a very long paragraph and then a short
Yeah.
sentence,
She
and I
has a
like
balance.
pulls me in.
Hmm.
Um, but we don't want the reader to think that they are subject to hidden craft. That should be entirely invisible to them. The story should at certain point go beyond that.
Mhm.
Uh,
Definitely.
what else can I do? What can else would you like to talk about?
Well, I guess before it gets too late here, because it's 1 a.m.,
Yeah.
is there something you want to say to the writers of the fight chapter? Or just to writers? Beyond, you
So
have
it would
42
probably
different
be
voices.
much the same,
Yeah.
which is, the ones I selected or recommended for you um, resonated for me
Hmm.
in a different way, and that I'm just one person. Um, if someone else had read through all of those selections, they may have picked different things and made different recommendations, and they would be as correct as I am or was at the time. That I think I would like to think that what drew me to the finalists was the integrity of the voice and the not the plot, not the description of marvelous background, because we all can get very good at that
Hmm.
without putting any of ourselves into it. But you have a sense that there's a soul singing behind the work.
Yeah.
Um, that I would like to think that's what I was doing in my best days. Maybe that's what I'm doing.
Hmm.
Um, and then to apologize to those who wish they weren't in or didn't get picked number one or whatever it turned out to be. Uh,
Yeah. Well, a lot of the stories are great, but yeah, you can't pick all of them. So it's never easy.
no, it's not unlike resumes. I work at the University of Illinois now, and whenever we've got a job opening, oh my God, the resumes just pour in.
Hmm.
And it's the nature of the economy, and it's the nature of people who want the benefits, because Illinois has a great program for that. Um, do I want to spend the morning reading 500 resumes? Not productive. And so we reduce it down to a subset of scan for typos. If there are
Yeah.
typos in the resume, they get rejected. Now, that doesn't mean that the person isn't perfect for the role. It's just I'm winnowing down my workload
Hmm.
in certain ways that may or may not be entirely, well, they're understandable, but they're may not give credit to the people who really want that job. You
Yeah.
know, but what else can you do? I mean, there's more stuff to read than there is time to read it. So you have
Yeah.
to give some thought to that.
Yeah, it was at first it was difficult because I was doing the opposite of what you're doing with the anthology, which is when I got stories instead of just out rejecting it, I was responding when people had typos and stuff and going, you have a chance to fix it. And there were so many people who were rude, but I was
I
giving them a second
know.
chance. I was
It's
giving them a chance.
stunning to me,
Yeah.
you know. And it's almost as if we have insulted them by
Yeah.
saying, their fly is down, or
Hmm.
their shirt is buttoned in properly, and they get upset. But
Hmm.
really, I'm taking the time to help make this a better piece, and you're getting angry with me.
Yeah.
um,
Hmm. So
I
it took
couldn't
a lot of
imagine that editor who found that typo in my work after I'd sent it out so many different times.
oh, it's better.
um, as far as I'm concerned, she's a genius. She's a wonder on this earth. And, I
Yeah.
wish I had the time to show her everything that I've written so that it could become better just from that one moment. I couldn't imagine saying, "How dare you point out a typo to me?"
Yeah,
You know,
I've always been so grateful to editors. They're amazing. There's a really good Facebook group that's based in Canada, but they're from editors all over the world. It's I think it's called Editors of the Earth. It's on
mm,
Facebook. It's a pretty good group, but if it ever gets out of off topic, an admin will come in and say stop, And that's what I like, is that they stick
Yeah,
to editing. Um, but anyway, speaking of social media, where can people who want to find you or your work find you or your work?
I try to avoid social media
Okay.
um, as much as possible. Part of that was that as my son was growing up in grade school and junior high school, he's just took the bar in California, so that
Oh,
he's 29 now. But
great.
during that period of time, I was not allowed to have a Facebook account or any of them. Stay away from it, Dad, and then I won't have to worry about you embarrassing me. And it was only when he got to college and didn't care anymore. Um, so I don't think there's a presence out there of much of my work. They're welcome to write and ask to see something, but um, there was a period of my life when I constructed a website that had selections from
Mhm.
both stories and published works or links to published works. And um, I think it was part of WordPress blog, and I lost the password, and they wouldn't give me my password back after a couple of years. So I just lost track of the theme of it. But
I can look you up and
they
probably
can
find
they
some of
can
your
look me
writing.
up and find a few things. There's stuff certainly out there to be found.
Yeah. I mean, I found some of your work when I searched for it, so it's there. Yeah.
Yeah, in fact, I have 3 pieces in Aiki-News going back to the 80s and 90s, because it was published almost exclusively in Japan at the time.
Hmm.
Um, and I had forgotten about them, actually. One was about my teacher breaking my arm, one was um, about the experience of just training. One was about hakamas, the long black skirts that black belts wear.
Yeah.
And I came across the entire collection of Aiki-News that are now on the internet because someone who, out of respect for the editor, Stan Pranin, who was one of my teachers, and when he passed away, his students actually took all of that work that he did and built a website. Unbeknownst to me, I wouldn't have never known that stuff was there. So sometimes, you know, not our best, but our perhaps most interesting, but at least a slice of the pie is available to be found.
Hmm.
Um,
Well, all right. Thanks for letting me talk with you today. Well, it's
my
nice.
pleasure.
Hi everyone. I just wanted to take a moment to tell everyone about something really exciting to me, which I mentioned in a few other videos, but maybe you missed it. It's about the merch store. I've worked really hard on the merch store because it's not just a way to pay the people who worked hard on the project, but also a way to give to charity, United Through Reading. There's going to be a token payment going to them, and from book sales and also for merchandise sales. So I'd like to just quickly show you the store if you have a minute. If you go to redbubble.com, it might be a little difficult to find my shop. Sometimes it doesn't show up immediately. There's going to be links in the description how to find it. But there's a lot of different things that you could look at through the shop. Different patterns. This pattern is from the book title itself I took to make. So you can get a shirt, but you can also click something down here, which is view the design on the products. And then when you click that, you can see a bunch of different products, from shirts to iPhone covers to skins and more, like board prints and yeah, pins. And for this design, I really like the tote bag. And Let's continue on with some other designs. So the other designs are just as good, and you do about the same thing. You go here, you scroll down, and then you see all the products involved with this design. So this is the title, Book of 42, without 42 Stories Anthology Presents part. It's just the main part of it, the impact, Book of 42, squared. It's a little harder to see the square than this one, but it's there when you actually go to the product. You can see it, like clicking here, for example. You can see the squared. Yeah, it appears in there. What's cool about Redbubble is they make all the products. I just send the art. So if I want to show you more designs, you can go. So I mentioned, for example, the Anthology Presents part. Well, I have that on this part, on this product, I mean. And so you can see the mouse pad, hats. You can have a blanket for your cat. They have so many clothes, varieties of clothes. They have a laptop sheet, which is pretty neat for this one. I think this one has the most products, and I'd probably recommend this one for someone interested. What's interesting is this tapestry. I've read up on it, and it's more like a blanket or a towel. So if you want to not forget your towel, here's your 42 Stories Anthology Presents Book of 42 towel, 42 squared towel, and then or a bath mat, some acrylic art. It just keeps going with different things. And there's a scarf, a backpack, and there's more designs that I'd like to show you if you have a minute. And so I'll just show you one more, and then you can go on your own to see the other two right there. What's really cool about this one, I think this is the right one. If it's not, then I'll jump to the other one because the two selections kind of look similar. Yeah, this is just the one logo version where you can see the logo of 42 squared. So I do have to show you the other one. The one in the middle is just kind of a black design, and it's interesting, but this one's cool because what I did was I took the design of the logo, 42 squared, and I multiplied it by 42. So here you have a design for this example, the pet mat, and the 42 squared logo appears 42 times. So if you really want to get your 42 squareds money's worth, this would be the design for you. There's a clock that I really think is neat. And what's interesting is if you go to a product like the clock, you can set it to what you want. So say that I want this to be wood. I just click this, it's wood. Actually, it's bamboo. That's really cool. And then the color is for the dial. So the clock hands now change. And I think that's really interesting. This is probably the clock that I will get later on, and it'll be right behind me. So yeah, it's not just that I'm trying to sell you merch. I'd like to give to the editors and the artists, and all that's coming directly from me. So what I'm doing to make up for that is selling merchandise. But the merchandise is also good because it doesn't just promote the anthology, it also promotes all the authors inside of it. And I hope that by having this available, it'll reach audiences who are interested in those writers and those artists, and then we could get their names out there to more people. Okay, so that's all of my that's all of my shtick about the merchandise. Thanks for sticking around.